Imagine your country goes mad. Imagine the place where your family has lived peacefully for decades suddenly declares you an enemy of the state. It strips you of all your rights, threatens you, deports you. This is what happened to the Jews in 1930s Germany, thanks to the racial policies of one man, Adolf Hitler.
Für Sie genügt nicht die bloße Ablegung des Bekenntnisses, ich glaube, sondern der Schwur, ich kämpfe.
But this terrible situation was faced not only by Germany's practicing Jews, but also by Germans who didn't even think they were Jewish. Most were Christians, who just happened to have distant Jewish relatives.
It was ridiculous. Suddenly I heard that I'm a quarter Jew.
The Nazis had a name for them, the Mischlinge, or half-breeds.
Mischling singular, Mischlinge plural are horrible terms. They mean bastard, hybrid, mutt. Just shows you what the Nazis thought of these individuals.
But amazingly, many Mischlinge and even some full Jews not only tolerated Hitler, they actively supported him. Many would fight for him.
Ich war ja als Soldat, ich trug die Hoheitsabzeichen meiner Deutschlands an meiner Uniform.
Some even joined the murderous SS. It begged the question, why? How could they have fought for someone hell-bent on their destruction? Were these Mischlinge traitors to their own people? Or were they simply doing their best to survive in an impossible situation?
Ich wäre draufgegangen und hätte dann geschrien, ihr Banditen, ihr Verbrecher und so weiter. Und da wäre einer gekommen, hätte Bumm gemacht, dann wäre ich dann tot gewesen. Und da hätte niemandem was geholfen.
This is the strange story of the Jews who fought for Hitler. Berlin, 1933. On the streets and in the cafes, there was a new wave of optimism. After decades of political instability, economic depression and joblessness, things at last seemed to be on the up. And many put it down to their new leader, Adolf Hitler. Hitler had offered the Germans hope. Whilst many people knew of his hatred for the Jews, many German Jews simply didn't think he would carry out his anti-Semitic threats on taking office.
When Hitler came into power, for all his exterminationist vocabulary, especially in Mein Kampf and then also in his speeches, most Jews did not see the writing on the wall.
Neither did those Germans married to Jews or with distant Jewish relatives.
They knew it was not good to be Jewish. They knew that having partial Jewish descent was also something that could be problematic. But they didn't equate themselves as being Jewish and didn't think that they were in the crosshairs of Hitler's Holocaust.
Immediately after taking power, Hitler did exactly as he promised. Anti-Semitism became government policy. The Nazis set about removing Germany's 500,000 Jews from public life. It started slowly, at first. Jewish-owned shops and businesses were boycotted. They were daubed with graffiti. A Nazi Party militia turned customers away. Books were burned to cleanse German literature of Jewish writers. Then, anti-Semitism was enshrined in law with Aryans and non-Aryans legally segregated. They were made to sit in separate compartments in trams or specially designated rows in the cinema. And Jews were banned from the civil service in April 1933. Rolf von Sudau was then just 9 years old. He had a Jewish grandfather, Alexander. Rolf quickly witnessed the effects of Hitler's racial policy on his grandfather's life.
He was a very famous doctor, and he had to quit his practice. He was a doctor for the railway and so, and he was an officer in the First World War. But that doesn't make any difference. He was so, and for him it was a disaster.
But for all their loathing of the Jews, the Nazis quickly hit a problem. Legally, who actually was a Jew? How do you define Jewishness? It was easy to tell the so-called Ostjuden, immigrants from Eastern Europe. They wore the readily identifiable garb of orthodoxy and spoke Yiddish. They had their own culture and ethnic identity. And crucially, they practiced Judaism. But very few German Jews did the same. They had lived in the country for centuries. These German Jews were fully integrated into German society, going to the same social events as Nazis. They wore the same clothes, ran businesses supplying the state. They were indistinguishable in appearance or practice from so-called Aryan Germans. In fact, they were Germans.
For centuries, they had assimilated, intermarried, contributed to the culture, had served in the armies, and so they were very intertwined with German Gentile society.
Many of them weren't even Jewish by religion, but by descent. Crucially, they were Christians. By the mid-1930s, 80% of German Jews had converted to Christianity. One such example was Rolf von Sudau's grandfather, Alexander. Despite having a Jewish mother, he had been raised in the Christian faith.
He was not Jewish at all. He was Christian, and all his parents have married in the Christian way.
Sometimes, German Jews integrated society simply for love. This is exactly what happened to Fritz Steinwasser's grandparents.
Mein Großvater väterlicherseits war ein Jude und hat dann meine Großmutter kennengelernt. Naja, wie das dann so eben ist mit jungen Leuten, die haben sich verliebt und die haben dann auch geheiratet. Und dann ist der Großvater zum katholischen Glauben übergetreten. Und ich habe das nicht gewusst. Also der ist dann gläubiger Katholik geworden.
Either way, the last thing many of these Germans or their descendants considered themselves was Jewish.
Ich bin auch nicht da mit dem Judentum zu tun gehabt, im Gegenteil. Und ich bin damit erst konfrontiert worden, als die Nazis an die Macht kamen, 1933. Bis dahin habe ich das nicht gewusst.
Sich! Sich! Sich!
September 1935, Nuremberg. The annual Nazi Party rally. It was an impressive showcase, and thousands saluted the Führer.
Blank und rank sein, flink wie Windhunde,
zäh wie Leder und hart wie Kruppstahl.
And it was here that Adolf Hitler announced the next stage in his racial policy towards the Jews of Germany and their descendants, in what became known as the Nuremberg Laws.
Und von keinem ein Leid erdulden.
The idea was to define who was a Jew and who was not, once and for all.
Hitler bringing out the Nuremberg Laws was his attempt to bring order to his racial policies, to organize four groups of people, the Aryans, the Jews, and then two new racial categories, half-Jews and quarter-Jews.
Hitler's Nuremberg Laws defined any practicing Jew or anyone with 3 or more Jewish grandparents as being fully Jewish, whether they practiced Judaism or not. These full Jews were deprived of their citizenship, denied the right to vote, and excluded from public office. But that wasn't the end of it. Hitler didn't just target full Jews. Germans who had 1 or 2 Jewish grandparents were targeted too. These people were labeled Mischlinge.
Mischling singular, Mischlinge plural are horrible terms. The Nazis used these terms to describe what they called half-Jews and quarter-Jews, half-breeds. The literal definition of Mischling is mutt. They use it for dogs of mixed breeds. But the connotation back then was that you were subhuman, you were inferior.
Two Jewish grandparents made you a first-degree Mischling or half-Jew. One made you a second-degree Mischling or quarter-Jew. Suddenly, this new law labeled many people with distant Jewish relatives as half or quarter Jews. Rolf von Suda was a second-degree Mischling or quarter Jew in the eyes of the law.
And when I was 11 years old in 1935, suddenly I heard that I'm a quarter Jew because my grandfather was Jewish. It was ridiculous, definitely, yeah. I didn't like it. And I felt very, very bad.
According to a Reich census from the late 1930s, there were over 500,000 full Jews in Germany, about 72,000 half-Jews, and 39,000 quarter Jews. Initially, persecution of these part Jews was less severe than for full Jews. They were restricted on who they could marry and had to obtain a certificate of fitness for marriage.
In the race laws, half-Jews could only marry other half-Jews. Quarter Jews were allowed to marry Gentiles, but they had to get special permission. So it was all regulation of sexual behavior, and if you deviated from the group that you were supposed to interact with, you could be brought up on the charge of Rassenschande, racial defilement. So if you were a half-Jew and you slept with a Gentile, you could be brought up on trial and sent to jail.
Nearly 2,000 people would be charged with racial defilement. Meanwhile, half and quarter Jews instantly witnessed how their new status affected their lives.
The thing I never forget, why I was playing football with a boy just opposite the house of my grandfather. Suddenly, at the end of the play, the mother of him, she says, do you have to play with a Jewish boy? And it was the first time that I know that people knew about me now, and it was terrible.
Fritz Steinwasser and his brother Willi were labeled quarter Jews. They saw how a family could be torn apart.
Naja, wir waren 15, 16 Jahre alt. So wie das dann die Mutter gesagt hat, die Tante gegrüßt, wenn wir sie getroffen haben. Und dann hat sie eines Tages gesagt, ihr braucht mich nicht zu grüßen, ihr Bengel, ihr Judenbengel, ich will mit euch nichts zu tun haben.
This sudden hardening in their day-to-day lives now left all categories of German Jews with a stark choice, whether to stay or quietly leave. Then in November 1938, there was an event that would raise the stakes for all Germans of Jewish descent. An orgy of Nazi-sponsored anti-Semitic violence erupted on Germany's streets. Synagogues were burned. 30,000 full Jews were arrested and 100 were killed. It became known as Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Thousands of full Jews and some Mischlinge chose to leave, but for many, this was simply out of the question.
These people were patriots through and through. And so it was very hard to ask these people who were German to leave Germany when that's all they knew and all they loved.
One example of a full Jew who opted to stay was Edgar Jacobi. Jacobi had volunteered for service in World War I, where he won the Iron Cross. He then worked as a film director in Hollywood in the 1930s, before returning to Germany and meeting his Aryan wife. To marry her, he had to falsify his papers. He remained in Germany under this new, false identity. Jacobi was a German patriot, and despite the frightening violence against Jews, he was determined to fight for the fatherland, if he got the chance. He put himself forward for the Army Reserves. Jacobi was a willing volunteer, but as a full Jew, he should never have been allowed in the army. At this stage, half Jews and quarter Jews, on the other hand, were still allowed to serve the fatherland in the military. As a result, they were safe from persecution for the time being, especially as Adolf Hitler needed them. September the 1st, 1939, the Germans attacked Poland. The German army rolled across the border. In its ranks were thousands of half-Jews and quarter Jews, the so-called Mischlinge. Many of them saw fighting for the Reich as a way of gaining favor and a way to protect their families.
One side, I have to take an oath to Hitler, who I hate. But on the other side, I'm serving a nation that I love. And since I have to be here anyway, I might as well make the best of it, because if I have a good record and I get some respect from my superiors, it's going to help my family. And quite often, a lot of these soldiers would show up in public places with their Jewish relatives in uniform to show, hey, this is a respectable family. They have sons and grandsons in the military, and they should be respected.
One example of a patriotic Mischling was half-Jew Werner Goldberg. An article in a German newspaper in 1939 talked of the victory in Poland and showed a heroic image of a young warrior, the archetypal German soldier. It was Goldberg.
He was blonde, very clear blue eyes. For 3 months, he was in a lot of German military propaganda newspapers and magazines as the typical Aryan-looking soldier, until they found out that his father was a Jew.
An estimated 100,000 other soldiers with Jewish heritage fought alongside Werner Goldberg in Hitler's conquering army. It showed just how flawed the Nuremberg laws were. It wasn't just lesser ranks who were compromised by the Nuremberg laws. Some of Hitler's most senior generals fell into the same dangerous categories. Three of Hermann Göring's top Luftwaffe officers were Mischlinge, including his most senior and capable Air Force commander, Field Marshal Milch. Milch had overseen the development and re-equipping of the Luftwaffe and built it into the modern and powerful force that spearheaded Hitler's blitzkrieg. He reported directly to Göring.
But many people have asked, how in the world does a half-Jew, Milch, become a field marshal in Hitler's military? He was a brilliant mind, no question about it. Ran Lufthansa in the 20s. Hitler called him in to help run the Luftwaffe. He was the most prominent personality for personnel planning and production. Hitler had said in 1936 that there are two names linked with the birth of our Luftwaffe, Milch's and Göring's.
Even though he was essential to the war effort, Milch was investigated by the Gestapo under the Nuremberg laws. His father, Anton Milch, was a Jew. Göring would have none of it. In his book, he decided who was a Jew and not the Nuremberg laws.
When rumors were flying around about his Jewish background, his mother went to the officials and said, my Jewish husband, Anton Milch, is actually not the father of my 6 children. It's my Aryan lover, who happens to be my uncle, and by the way, he's dead.
Göring encouraged Milch's mother to sign an affidavit confirming that her Aryan uncle had fathered her children. He personally took it to Hitler, and Milch was declared of pure Aryan ascent.
And with a stroke of Hitler's pen, he was quote-unquote Aryanized. So we see in this case that during the Third Reich, Jewish ancestry was horrible, but incest was okay.
Göring had lied and reinvented the past to save Milch. But to ensure more valuable men were not investigated by the authorities, Hitler created various ways around the Nuremberg laws.
There was different classifications of exemptions that Hitler would give to half-Jews and quarter-Jews to remain in the service or be promoted. The first types were just Genehmigungen, or special permissions, that allowed a person to remain in the military. The second types were also Genehmigungen, sometimes called Sondergenehmigungen, special exemptions, that allowed somebody to remain in the military and be promoted. And then there were other guys that immediately just got the straight-out Deutschbürgerlichkeitserklärungen, and these were the German blood declarations.
These exemptions, like the German blood declarations, let Hitler have the pick of those men with Jewish ancestry and Aryanize them if he deemed them worthy. He often personally oversaw individual cases, and only a small proportion were ever successful. In all, 22 generals and 7 admirals were Aryanized. They included Admiral Bernhard Roger, a quarter Jew who received a German blood declaration in 1939.
He was a tragic figure. His mother's mother was Jewish. He lost his wife and mother-in-law to suicide because of the Nazi persecution. He was persecuted. He was a deeply religious man. He hated the Nazis, but on the other side, he had this duty that he felt obligated to his fatherland.
Roger served in command of the Atlantis, a merchant ship converted to carry guns and which harried Allied convoys. Roger sank or captured almost 24 Allied ships for a combined total of over 150,000 tons of shipping. He went on to win the coveted Knight's Cross with oak leaves. Though much harder, any common soldier stood a small chance of being Aryanized too if they won similar prestigious bravery awards. In May 1940, Hitler's armies invaded France in another devastating blitzkrieg attack. France and her allies were crushed in just over a month. It was another stunning victory. Once again, half-Jewish and quarter-Jewish soldiers fought in the ranks. Among them, quarter-Jew Fritz Steinwasser, and amazingly, Edgar Jacobi, the full Jew who'd falsified his marriage papers. He'd been called up just before the invasion. He led a company of combat cameramen and photographers. Jacobi's newsreels captured the lightning advance of the German panzers. Jacobi and many other soldiers of Jewish descent fought with distinction. They hoped their loyal service would be rewarded and get them acceptance in mainstream German society. But they were wrong. Because when they returned to Germany, half-Jews, first-degree Mischlinge, were expelled from the army. Instead, they could only take up low-grade work. Werner Goldberg, the ideal German soldier, was one of them. It was a callous way to treat men who had risked their lives for their fatherland. Quarter Jews, second-degree Mischlinge, were still allowed to serve. When Hitler's armies stormed into Russia in the summer of 1941, there were tens of thousands of quarter Jews in the ranks of the Wehrmacht, the German army. Fritz Steinwasser was one of them.
Ich war ja als Soldat, ich trug die Hoheitsabzeichen meiner Deutschlands an meiner Uniform.
His racial status was known to his superiors. However, other men feared that if they came clean about their Jewish ancestry, their treatment could get worse, so they decided to keep quiet. Rolf von Sudau had been called up for military service and was fighting in Russia as a panzer gunner. Von Sudau had never felt Jewish, so he decided to lie rather than admit he was a quarter Jew.
I lied because I want to prove them that I was a brave man and that I'm okay for being an officer. It's quite clear. Any other people would have done the same. They didn't want to do it. It's quite, yeah. I want to show them that all the mixture things and all these bad things which are told about the Mischlinge, that's not correct.
However, on the eve of promotion, Rolf von Sudau, would pay for his deception. He was summoned by his commanding officer.
There came the major and says, Herr von Sudau, we have to speak, and you can't be that. And he knew about of my documents that I'm quarter Jew. And then the whole thing was up and I was going to prison.
He was imprisoned for 21 days as a punishment for his actions. Von Sudau was demoted, but he would eventually rejoin his unit and continue to fight for Hitler. Another man who had lied and was found out was propaganda officer Edgar Jacobi. His true identity as a full Jew had been revealed. Jacobi was sent back to Germany and imprisoned. As a full Jew, he and countless others were now in grave danger. Because in the autumn of 1941, Germany's full Jews started to be deported, initially to ghettos in Eastern Europe, and then to extermination camps. The first deportations of the German Jews to the ghettos began in October of that year. These evacuations invariably meant death. The Jews were even made to pay the cost of the journey to the east. 20,000 German Jews were sent to the Łódź ghetto in Poland. 25,000 were sent to Riga in Latvia. In November 1941, many of those German Jews arriving in Riga were massacred as soon as the train arrived. In Minsk, Byelorussia, German Jews suffered a similar fate. Yet surprisingly, very few of Hitler's quarter Jewish soldiers were aware what Nazi Germany had reserved for their relatives. But Fritz Steinwasser, the quarter Jewish soldier, did chance upon a horrifying spectacle whilst serving on the front line at Dunaburg in Latvia. He was stuck in a traffic jam of advancing German vehicles when he saw the reality of the Nazi policy of genocide towards the Jews.
Ich war auf der Brücke und konnte dann in dieses Gefängnis einschauen. Und dann war hier der Block des Gefängnisses und dann stand dort eine Reihe von SS-Leuten mit Peitschen und Stöcken. Und dann trieben die dann so die armen Schweine da, die armen Menschen, nackt ausgestellt, ob alt oder jung, und durch diese Gasse mit Schlägen. Und dann mussten sie sich niederknien und dann kriegten sie einen Kopfschuss. Und dann sprangen dann einige in die Grube und haben sie dann die Leichen sortiert, damit sie nicht kreuz und quer durcheinander lagen. Und das war für mich ein furchtbarer Anblick. Und ein alter Mann mit einem Bart und ein kleiner Junge von vielleicht 4, 5 Jahren an der Hand. Und der Junge weinte und dann hat ein alter Mann ihn getröstet und hat dann gesagt, was weiß ich nicht, ich habe es nicht verstanden. Aber hat dann zu ihm zugeredet und dann hat der Junge lächelnd seinen Großvater angestrahlt. Also, mir ging das Herz kaputt.
Hast du gedacht damals, dass das könnte dir oder deiner Großvater sein?
Natürlich, natürlich. In dem Augenblick habe ich meinen Großvater vor mir gesehen, der zwar noch nicht damals deportiert worden ist.
Fritz Steinwasser's grandfather, along with 43,000 other German Jews, was later sent to the Theresienstadt concentration camp in Czechoslovakia. His grandfather died there in 1943. Fritz would not find this out until after the war. Another man who was caught up in this policy was Rolf von Sudau's grandfather. This photo is the last known picture of his grandfather alive. It shows him being led away with other Germans for evacuation. He died in a hospital a few days later. Many thousands more like them were murdered in the death camps. Despite what was happening to the Jews, and what some like Fritz Steinwasser had witnessed, they still chose to carry on fighting.
Niemand kann einen rollenden Zug aufhalten alleine. Ich wäre draufgegangen und hätte dann geschrien, ihr Banditen, ihr Verbrecher und so weiter. Und da wäre einer gekommen, hätte Bumm gemacht und wäre ich dann tot gewesen. Und da hätte niemandem was geholfen.
Hitler had wanted to go even further and reserve the same treatment for the half-Jews. But then he changed his mind. He granted them a last-minute reprieve. Rather than be killed in the extermination camps, many half-Jews found themselves forced to work instead for another organ of the Nazi state. The organization TOT was a civil and military engineering group that built whatever Hitler needed. From prison camps to arms manufacture and massive engineering projects like the Atlantic Wall. Overseeing it all from 1942 was Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister for Armaments. The organization TOT numbered over 1 million men. From 1943 onwards, between 10 and 20,000 half-Jews were drafted into it. But by a strange twist of fate, the fact that they had been expelled from the army and ended up in TOT actually spared many of them from death. As a result, they were spared combat, especially the killing fields of the Eastern Front, where more and more Germans were being slaughtered by 1943, and where both Fritz Steinwasser and Rolf von Sudau found themselves. But a rare handful of German Jews didn't just fight. They actively embraced the most extreme expression of Nazi ideology. They joined the Waffen-SS. The SS were Hitler's political soldiers. They had their own special insignia and privileges and swore blind allegiance to Hitler. They took the Führer's ideology as their own. The SS had a reputation as ruthless fighters who murdered prisoners and civilians in cold blood. Some death camps were guarded by the SS. So the idea that a German Jew would sign up to serve and get away with it was unthinkable. Nevertheless, that is exactly what one full Jew ended up doing. Karl-Heinz Löwy was raised as a religious Jew. He was born in 1920 in Munich, and both his parents were ardent German patriots. To avoid the Nuremberg laws, he assumed the name Werner Grenacher and created an Aryan ancestry for himself. At the start of the war, he escaped to France. But then the Nazis caught up with him.
When the Nazis came in, he felt the walls of Nazi Germany falling in on him, so he thought if he was proactive, he would be able maybe to protect himself. So with his false name, he went to a German recruiting station and said, I want to join the Wehrmacht. And the Wehrmacht said, you know, we don't have recruiting ability in foreign areas, but the Waffen-SS does. And he was sent down to the Waffen-SS office, and then he was recruited into the Waffen-SS.
When he faced the medical examination, he simply lied. He claimed that his circumcision was the result of an infection, leading his comrades to jokingly call him the Jew. Lervy fought with the SS on the Finnish front. Despite the daily risk of discovery, he showed exceptional bravery and was awarded the Iron Cross and prestigious Close Combat Clasp for soldiers who had fought the enemy at close quarters. Lervy always maintained his SS colleagues had their hands full fighting the Russians and knew nothing of the Nazi death camps or the reality of the Holocaust. In fact, he counted them as friends.
He was able to acclimate into an elite military unit that was extremely anti-Semitic and survive. And he said, you know, it's the craziest thing, Brian. On one side, I love these guys. They would do anything for me. They were elite warriors. They fought hard. But had they known I was Jewish, they would have changed on me in a second, and they would have hung me up on the first tree.
So Lervy kept quiet and did what he needed to do to survive in the SS. However, by 1944, the war was coming to a close. As the Allies landed in Normandy and the Russians pushed ever deeper towards the heart of Germany from the east, the end was in sight for Hitler's German Jews and his Jewish soldiers. On May the 8th, 1945, the war in Europe finally ended. Fritz Steinwasser survived the Russian front. Rolf von Suda fought the Allies in Normandy and was also still alive. And so remarkably was full Jew Edgar Jacobi, who had languished in prison in Germany. He'd only been saved when a bombing raid destroyed his prison records. By a mixture of fate, official pardons, or the choice of remaining silent, many half and quarter Jews, and even some full Jews, survived the war and avoided the fate of their relatives. Of those who fought for Hitler, the most high-profile was Field Marshal Milch, the Luftwaffe general whom Hitler had Aryanized in 1935.
Deutschland kam 1939 in einen Krieg hinein.
Eventually, Milch stood trial at Nuremberg for his complicity in the Nazis' crimes against humanity and war crimes. He was sentenced to life at Landsberg prison, but was released after 7 years. Milch never spoke publicly about these crimes against the Jews and his own Jewish heritage.
You could say he was a willing collaborator with Hitler in everything Hitler was doing. He was a criminal. He knew about forced labor going to Auschwitz. He knew about the experiments going on in Dachau, even sanctioned them. He was a horrible individual.
Half-Jew Werner Goldberg, the so-called archetypal soldier who was expelled from the army in 1940, survived the war. He would save his father's life after repeated attempts to send him to Auschwitz.
He's an example of many men who went to bat for their family members by going to the actual prison areas and so on to try to get their family members out. Most were unsuccessful. Werner Goldberg was successful in his case.
The fact that he could demonstrate against his father's treatment in his army uniform did his case no harm. Thanks to this brave action, his father avoided the infamous death camp. After the war, Werner Goldberg settled back into life in Berlin and had 3 children. Admiral Bernhard Roger, the highly decorated naval commander, also survived the war. He went on to be a high-ranking officer in the post-war West German Navy and NATO. Full Jew Karl-Heinz Loewy, who had served in the Waffen-SS, deserted German lines and surrendered to the French. He remained in Munich and died in 2001. Another man to head to Allied lines at the first opportunity was Rolf von Suda, who had surrendered to the Canadians in Normandy in 1944. Rolf von Suda has always maintained the prejudice he experienced has made him a stronger person. He went on to have a successful career in television and movies. For his part, Fritz Steinwasser lost his brother in the war and was captured by the Russians. He spent several years in a prisoner of war camp before quietly returning to his life in Berlin. Today, those who survive are coming to terms with what they experienced. They face the curious reality of fighting for the very nation that wanted to destroy them and their relatives.
Und auch ihre Verbrechen und alles das, dafür bin ich auch selbst mit dran schuld, denn ich habe es ja mitgemacht. Obwohl ich guten Willens sagen kann, dass ich sowas nicht getan habe. Dass ich also jetzt irgendwie Menschen unterdrückt habe, dass ich Menschen gequält habe und so weiter. Aber mitgegangen, mitgefangen, mitgehangen, sagen die alten Nürnberger, ja.
To those who think he should have done something when he saw Jews being killed in 1941, Fritz Steinwasser has this to say.
Also wenn mich ein Jude fragt, warum hast du dagegen nichts unternommen? Und warum hast du zugeschaut, wie du mit deinem Volk da, und ich bin ja ein Stückchen davon, umgegangen wird? Dann würde ich ihn fragen, was er denn getan hätte in dieser Situation.
These men have also had to wrestle with many awkward questions of collaboration and belonging, their relationship with Judaism, and their place in German society. Today, Fritz Steinwasser has reconciled both the past and his mixed Jewish heritage.
Ich bin weder das eine noch das andere. Ich bin ein Mensch und als Mensch bin ich darum interessiert und bemüht, mit allen anderen Menschen der Erde, ob sie nun weiß oder schwarz oder gelb oder sonst wie sind, in guten Frieden zusammenzuleben. Das ist meine Devise.
So where does this leave the Jews who fought for Nazi Germany? Undoubtedly, they were faced with an impossible situation created by Hitler and his policy of racial hatred. This in turn led to impossible choices, made just to live. Fighting for Germany was more often than not an attempt to save loved ones and relatives. Often, for these men, staying alive was a struggle, but they did survive, and this simple fact was a small victory for Hitler's Jewish soldiers. Anton Mussert said he was a patriot. He said he loved the Netherlands. And he said he had nothing against Jews. He claimed he simply wanted to lead his country through the biggest crisis in its history. Unfortunately, he decided the best way to do this was to try and deal with Hitler. As leader of the Dutch Nazi Party, it would bring him to abandon his principles and betray his people. Because of his actions, the Dutch suffered a famine on a terrible scale. And as a result of his collaboration, the Jews in his country were systematically and ruthlessly murdered.
The Dutch just still don't want to admit, really, that a lot of them did things which were wrong. I just didn't know really until much later how bad they were, some of them.
So why did Anton Mussert choose to side with the Nazis? Was he simply weak, naive, a dupe for Hitler? Or was he just an evil and pernicious collaborator? Anton Mussert was born in 1894 into a peaceful and prosperous country. Holland had not been involved in any major war for over 140 years and had been neutral ever since. From an early age, Mussert showed he had an analytical mind and studied civil engineering. He worked for the Utrecht Council, helping to design and build roads, rail, and canals. He was also a strong patriot. In the 1920s, he became active in several extreme right organizations. The emergence of extremism was seen as highly unusual in what had long been a harmonious society. But then came an event that would breathe life into his extremist beliefs. In 1929, banks and stock markets in New York crashed. The fallout spread like wildfire around the world, causing governments to collapse and businesses to fold. Thousands lost their jobs and began to starve. The economic depression was deeper and longer in the Netherlands than anywhere else in Europe, in part due to disastrous decisions by the Dutch government. With that government seemingly unable to cope, Holland's population sought out radical solutions: communism or fascism. Anton Mussert saw his chance. On the 14th of December 1931, he founded the National Socialist Movement, or NSB.
Die einzige Macht und alleinige Macht in Deutschland.
Mussert's NSB was modeled on Hitler's Nazi Party in Germany. It shared the Nazi beliefs of love of nation, a willingness to work, and in strength of leadership. As Hitler was soon to be the Führer, or leader of Germany, Mussert wanted to be the Führer or de Leder of Holland. Hitler had his brown-shirted thugs to reinforce his message. Mussert formed his own strong-arm squad, called the Mussert Guard. But the NSB had two key differences from the Nazis. It tolerated religion, and it was not anti-Semitic. Mussert even declared, "Every good Dutch Jew is welcome in our party." As the Great Depression sank deeper, Mussert sold himself as the savior of Holland. And he appeared to be hugely popular, addressing record crowds. Fear of communism was what drove most to the party. Mussert or Moscow became the NSB battle cry. The party membership grew quickly to over 6,000. Just 5 years after its formation, Mussert's NSB was such a success, it caught the attention of Hitler himself. Mussert was invited to meet the Führer in Berlin in late 1936. There he pledged his future cooperation in the fight against communism. Filled with pride, Mussert unleashed his party in a general election. But it won only 4% of the vote. It did even worse in local elections in 1939. The utter failure looked like the last straw for the NSB. But these would be the final elections they would fight. The Nazis would see to that. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. The Second World War had begun. Mussert thought his time had come. Seizing the moment, the NSB leader made contact with German military intelligence, the Abwehr, to discuss the Nazi annexation of Holland. He agreed to embark on a secret plot to kidnap the Dutch Queen, Wilhelmina. The man who claimed to be a staunch patriot was plotting an act of high treason. It would be the first of many betrayals of his people. But the plot was discovered, and several NSB members were arrested, though Mussert himself escaped and fled into hiding. But he wouldn't have to stay there for long. On the 10th of May 1940, Germany invaded Holland. Hitler's Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, took the Dutch completely by surprise. 16,500 airborne troops were parachuted into the country. In the coastal town of Heemstede lived Hans Oppenheimer and his wife Rita. They had 3 children. The Oppenheimers were German Jews who had traveled to Holland via England in search of a better life. 9-year-old Rudy had no idea what lay in store for his family.
The Dutch were, of course, shooting at the planes. You could see these little puffs. In the end, you could see them hitting them. Those planes were burning, spiraling out of control, then sort of making a pirouette and dropping in the meadows which surrounded Heemstede. So with my friends, we cycled there to have a look at this, and we managed to get into the meadows and see all this junk lying there, really. We collected souvenirs, took it back to school, and had a great time. We swapped it.
The Germans made rapid progress, but faced pockets of stiff resistance, particularly in the city of The Hague and outside the port of Rotterdam. Rotterdam was Holland's second largest city with 500,000 people. Capture of its huge North Sea port was seen by Hitler as vital to his plans for the conquest of Europe. On the 14th of May, the Germans served the Dutch commanders in Rotterdam with an ultimatum: surrender or be destroyed. No reply was received, and at 1:20 in the afternoon, the bombers came. The Rotterdam Blitz leveled almost the entire city. "25,000 homes were destroyed. 80,000 were made homeless. Rotterdam surrendered. The next day, Holland conceded defeat. Despite being married to a German prince, Dutch Queen Wilhelmina, fearing for her life, fled to London.
After a heroic struggle, my nation that has attempted everything to maintain peace is being overpowered by sheer superiority of force. But morally, we can never be conquered. Our spirit will remain unbroken because our conscience is clear.
With Holland now in his possession, Hitler needed someone to take charge. So he appointed Viennese lawyer Arthur Seyss-Inquart as his leader in the Netherlands. Seyss-Inquart had form. He'd been in charge of the Nazification of Austria in 1938. As a sign of his goodwill, he ordered the release of all Dutch prisoners of war. Then he dissolved Parliament and began plans to Nazify Holland. He addressed the Dutch people on the 29th of May, calling for cooperation of two Germanic peoples of the same blood. His aim was to unite the Dutch behind the Nazis. He then made overtures to the NSB. Anton Mussert came out of hiding and gathered his NSB supporters together. If Mussert was not actually prime minister, he was at least now the most powerful Dutch politician remaining in the country. Grabbing this opportunity, Mussert presented Seyss-Inquart with a bold plan. He suggested taking over Queen Wilhelmina's vacant role as head of state to become de leader of Holland. Seyss-Inquart treated the idea with courtesy, and Mussert was invited to meet Hitler on the 23rd of September 1940. Mussert presented the Führer with a plan to create a league of Germanic peoples in Europe. This so-called Nordic Federation would have Hitler as its leader, but individual countries would also have separate leaders. Mussert proposed himself as the leader of Holland. Hitler cleverly threw the ball back to Mussert by suggesting that first his country must embrace National Socialism and should be what he called re-educated. Mussert agreed, seeing it as an opportunity for the rebirth of his beloved Holland. It was the first time that the Nazis would take advantage of Mussert's naivety. Mussert held a series of NSB rallies asking the Dutch people to follow him. He told them he would be their leader and promised them a safer, stronger Holland.
The Dutch people, my people, and I repeat the words of their hopes, to knock on Hitler's door and ask for a place in the new Europe. A Europe controlled by Hitler and Mussolini, a place according to their virtues and their abilities.
Mussert appeared to be getting what he wanted, but then the true face of Nazism was revealed. The Germans started to turn on Dutch Jews. In 1940, there were over 150,000 Jews living peacefully in Holland. The Germans had to move slowly but gradually they imposed their will. They began by issuing the entire population with identity cards detailing their racial background. Then all Jews were dismissed from government jobs and banned from public places.
We couldn't use public transport anymore. We couldn't buy in normal shops. We had to buy in the Jewish shops, which would only open for 2 hours a day. We also had a curfew. It was pretty rotten, being a Jew, really. The worst, I suppose, was being home, to have to be in your flat at 8 o'clock in the evening in the summer.
In Amsterdam, Dutch collaborators assaulted Jews in the street. But the Jews fought back, and when a Dutch Nazi was killed, the reprisal was swift. 400 Jewish men were snatched off the street and disappeared. Mussert, the self-styled leader, was outraged. He'd promised his people he'd protect them. Now they were being persecuted. There was nothing he could do. So in protest, thousands marched through the center of Amsterdam. It was the first sign that his authority was waning. For 48 hours, the workers of the city went on strike in support of the Jews. But the Germans didn't care. They shot and killed 9 of the strikers. Fearing a bloodbath, the protest was abandoned. But faced with such opposition, the Germans hardened their approach. They sealed off the Jewish quarter of Amsterdam, turning it into a ghetto. Within just a few months, Mussert's promise to protect his people was already ringing hollow. But his promise to re-educate his country was also ringing hollow to the Nazis. They thought the demonstrations showed that Mussert lacked the stomach for a fight. So Seyss-Inquart began to undermine Mussert by favoring other NSB members. The head of the Netherlands Bank was Rost von Tonnegen. He was a supporter of Nazification, even wishing to see the Dutch language replaced with German. He was an unpredictable, rabid anti-Semite, and he frightened even Mussert. Seyss-Inquart now appointed von Tonnegen as a co-leader of the NSB. With his position as NSB leader under threat, Mussert changed his moderate view on Jews. He agreed to expel Jews from the NSB and then launched a Jews Not Wanted campaign. It was yet another betrayal of his people. His dangerous game with the Nazis had taken a new, darker direction. And then came an opportunity to ingratiate himself with Hitler once again. In June 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Mussert thought that Holland might ride on the back of Hitler's conquests, so he offered the Nazis his assistance. He launched a recruitment drive for young men to join a Dutch legion and fight for Germany.
Auf dem Marsch zum Bahnhof.
The legion was first sent to Germany for training. Then almost 3,000 were ordered to the Eastern Front at Stalingrad. They fought with courage and distinction, but suffered terrible losses. It would cause deep resentment in Holland. Mussert then made another attempt to win back credibility by making a bold power play. He requested a further meeting with Hitler, at which he publicly swore an oath. He declared, "I swear to you, Adolf Hitler, as Germanic Führer, loyalty unto death, so help me God." In return, He'd asked to be installed as the deputy Führer of the entire German Reich. Hitler refused, but Mussert's position was then undermined again by events on the other side of the world. The Dutch East Indies colony, modern-day Indonesia, was the jewel in the Dutch imperial crown.
Further evidence of the development of the Netherlands East Indies. A typical washing day scene in Batavia canals goes side by side with a busy scene in the harbour. And in the towns, there were fine modern buildings vying with beautiful examples of old Dutch architecture.
The Dutch East Indies was also a huge producer of oil. Japan, the Nazis' allies, had no oil of its own, and it was just waiting for an excuse to invade. On the 7th of December 1941, the Japanese attacked the US naval base at Pearl Harbor, and the US declared war on Japan. In response, Queen Wilhelmina also declared war on Japan. This gave the Japanese the excuse they needed. 9 days later, Japanese forces invaded the Dutch East Indies.
These then were the islands which acted as a magnet to the greedy little men of Nippon. And with the fall of Singapore, they advanced swiftly upon Java and Sumatra.
The Dutch rose up and set the country's oil stores ablaze to prevent the Japanese getting their hands on them. But it was hopeless. By March 1942, the Japanese had overrun the islands. 2,000 Dutch were killed and 60,000 captured. Mussert begged his Nazi friend to stop the Japanese. But Hitler ignored him. For Mussert, it was another disaster. His own citizens had been slaughtered by Hitler's allies. Mussert's promise to protect his people had been completely undermined. With Mussert humiliated by Hitler, his rivals in the NSB moved against him. Soon after invasion, the Germans set up an arm of their security police, the Dutch SS. It even incorporated the Mussert Guard. Its head, one of Mussert's principal lieutenants, was Hendrik Feldmayer. Now, under pressure from the Nazis, Feldmayer demanded his men take their future orders from Hitler. Mussert reluctantly agreed. So on the 17th of May 1942, 600 Dutch SS swore an oath of allegiance not to Holland, but Hitler. It was even renamed the Germanic SS in the Netherlands, and soon they would become involved in the Nazis' most terrible crime. Of all the Nazi-occupied countries of Western Europe, the Netherlands had the highest proportion of Jews. Consequently, it was there that the Nazi solution to the Jewish problem was most drastic. In June 1942, the roundup began. For the Jews, there was no way out. The country was surrounded by hostile territory. There was nowhere to run. They were trapped.
Before we moved to Amsterdam in April '42, they introduced this Jewish star. You know, I had to wear a Jewish star. And here you can see one of my stars, which I wore. The star always had to be visible on the left-hand side, so you had lots of them. You had one on your coat, one on your blazer, one on your pullover, one on your shirt. Whenever you took anything off, it was still visible. But we didn't mind really wearing them at the time, because I recall we had the craze in those days that kids liked wearing as many badges as possible.
Of course, 10-year-old Rudi Oppenheimer had no idea that the star was a way for the Nazis to identify their victims. Most of the rounding up of Jews was carried out by the Dutch SS. That included the old Musset Guard. The Jews were sent to the Westerbork camp in northern Holland. Ironically, the Dutch government had built Westerbork as a refugee camp to house Jews escaping from Nazi Germany. It had even been built with Dutch Jewish money. It now became the main route to extermination. There was a railway line that ran directly to the Auschwitz and Sobibor death camps in Poland. In just 1 month, 11,000 were taken to the death camps. The rounding up and the transportations took place with Mussert's knowledge. All he requested was that former Jewish members of the NSB be spared. Even that was refused. Rounding up Jews was a lucrative business. One Dutch group, the Henneke column, took full advantage. Led by a Dutch mechanic, Wim Henneke, this special unit of 35 men, many of whom were members of Mussert's NSB, had agreed to clear the homes of the Jews after they'd been taken away. As in all other occupied countries in Europe, the furniture, clothes, and possessions of the Jews were stolen and redistributed in Germany. The Henneke column would invoice for their work, and it didn't take them long to realize how to make even more money. They would become bounty hunters. For each Jew they captured and turned in, Wim Henneke and his men received 7.5 guilders from the Nazis, equivalent to about £30 at the time. These are actual receipts given to Wim Henneke for the delivery of Jews. This is for a single Jew, date of birth 4th of August 1897. The second is for a family of 5 Jews in 1943. The total received, 37 guilders and 50 cents. The Henneke column were at their most active throughout 1942 and 1943, and it's thought they arrested between 8,000 and 9,000 Jews, including children. There is no record of Mussert doing anything to stop them. But the Dutch fought back. They began hiding Jews from the Nazis. The scheme was nicknamed the Onderdieker, or underdiving movement. An estimated 25,000 Jews were hidden during the war. Most famously Anne Frank, whose diary of her experience would become one of the most read books of all time. The Schwab family from Amsterdam managed to hide until the end of the war above a nightclub called the Alcazar. Harry Schwab even filmed his experiences with a small camera. These pictures reveal the cunning nature of some of the hiding places. Behind a wardrobe, under the stairs, or other secret compartments. Mussert knew what was happening and accepted it all. But by now he was fighting for his life. His power base was diminishing. His people had been slaughtered in the Far East. And now the Jews in Holland were being exterminated. He made repeated requests to meet Hitler, and finally got his meeting. Yet again, Hitler declined Mussert's idea to establish his Nordic Federation. but did give in to one request. He agreed to appoint Mussert de Leider, not just of the NSB, but now of all the Dutch people. In Dutch, Leider meant leader. But in German, and much to the amusement of Hitler, it had a less gracious meaning: unfortunate. Mussert returned to Holland, his credibility seemingly restored.
En gij, mijn Duitse kameraden, tot u zeg ik u.
In February 1943, Mussert and Seyss-Inquart held a joint Nazi-NSB rally, where Mussert pledged renewed support for the Nazis.
Met die duizenden die daarin zitten, dan zeggen wij Nederlandse kameraden tot u, mijn Duitse kameraden. Het zijn onze kameraden die daar zijn en wij staan en vallen met hen.
In reality, Mussert's new position was just a sham. As de Leider, he'd have no political power. He would just be a consultant. But in the eyes of ordinary Dutch people, Mussert had now become the Nazis' top emissary in Holland. And despite being reviled by the general public, the NSB was still active. The Oppenheimer family were about to find out how.
We could see the German soldiers and policemen going through our road, and we also saw they left the road without having knocked on our door, because we kept on watching through the curtains a little bit. My parents, of course, always told us not to be near the windows, but children don't listen to that. And then suddenly, about half an hour later, they came back, and they straight away knocked on our door, straight to our door only, and took us away.
Rudy would take many years to discover who tipped off the Nazis.
And it was only when I came back after the war that the lady below us told me that her neighbors, who were living one house further down the road, that they were collaborators called NSB, Nationaal Socialistische Bond, which were the Nazis in Holland, that they betrayed us.
The Oppenheimers ended up in the Westerbork transit camp.
The camp itself, I keep on telling people, wasn't too bad, really. It's quite small. It's only 500 meters by 500 meters. We got enough food to live on. We played football a lot outside the camp. I went to school there. They had a primary school. They obviously wanted to keep the camp clean, so each week you had to take a shower. You had a special bath card when it told you to go, and it would be stamped off. But the bad thing about it is it was called a transit camp, not for nothing.
Every Tuesday, a train would arrive at Westerbork, fill up with Jews, and then leave for the long journey to the death camps in Poland. The Oppenheimers, so far at least, had avoided being on the passenger list. But how?
We had a blue stamp on our ID card in Westerbork, which indicated that we were an exchange Jew because my sister Eve was born in Britain.
A family was classed as exchange Jews if one of them could prove they'd been born in any country the Nazis were at war with. This made them a valuable commodity. Exchange Jews could be swapped for German citizens imprisoned in other countries, such as Palestine and the USA. Eve Oppenheimer had been born in London in 1936 and had a British birth certificate. It qualified the family as exchange Jews.
We didn't have to go because there was some sort of rule by the commandant, who probably got the rule from Amsterdam, from the higher authorities, not to send those exchange Jews away. So we stayed there for 7 long months.
The Oppenheimers would be excused being listed for transfer, for now. As the harsh intentions of the Nazis and the NSB became clear, the Dutch people started to strike back. The Dutch resistance, fiercely loyal to their Queen of Orange, launched a series of attacks on prominent Dutch Nazis. In February 1943, the commander of the Dutch Legion, Lieutenant General Seyffardt, heard a knock at his door. As he opened the door, he was shot twice at point-blank range. 2 men fled the scene. Seyffardt died the next day, and the reprisals were swift. The Nazis took 50 men hostage and executed them. Faced with more resistance, the Dutch SS leader Hendrik Veldmayer embarked on Operation Silver Fur. Veldmayer assembled a 15-man death squad with the express purpose of carrying out retaliatory attacks against civilians. They murdered 54 Dutchmen, including the highly regarded political writer A.M. de Jong. Mussert was horrified. He bitterly opposed their actions and expelled Veldmayer from the NSB. He then demanded a further meeting with the Führer. But by now, Hitler had other things on his mind. In the Soviet Union, the German army was in full retreat. 100,000 men had been captured in Stalingrad. In North Africa, the British and American forces had Rommel's Afrika Korps surrounded. And the Americans were winning the war in the Far East. Hitler ordered the redoubling of the war effort. On the 18th of February, head of Nazi propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, called for total war.
Es will nicht den totalen Krieg, sagen die Engländer, sondern die Kapitulation. Wollt ihr den totalen Krieg?
The Nazis ordered all Dutch soldiers whom they'd captured in 1940 to switch sides and report for duty in the Dutch Legion. Dutch workers responded by downing tools again and refusing to work for the Third Reich. This unprecedented strike led to the deaths of 80 by firing squad. Mussert was witnessing his country spiraling out of control. He'd lost command of his police. 100 NSB members had been assassinated, and thousands of men had died on the Eastern Front. On the 4th of December 1943, Mussert, his reputation in tatters, had his last meeting with Hitler. Hitler told him that he would never be granted any political power. Mussert and his NSB were totally isolated. Detested at home, rejected by Hitler. And all this time, the Nazis' murder machine was still operating. On the 31st of January 1944, the Oppenheimer family's luck ran out. They were on the dreaded transport list and reported to the railway siding, fearing the worst.
Well, in the end, it was our turn to go because on a Monday afternoon, they pushed the train into the camp again, as usual. But it was an ordinary train with seats.
They weren't to be taken to Auschwitz after all. In fact, all exchange Jews were being relocated to a very different camp in Germany.
At 3 o'clock we left, and then the rumor went round in the train we would go to Germany, to a place called Bergen-Belsen.
Bergen-Belsen was not an extermination camp. It had been a prison for enemies of the state, but now it was being used to detain exchange Jews.
We suddenly saw a very high double barbed wire fence. On the fence we noticed there were boards in German every 100 meters that if you get too close to the fence they would shoot you without any warning. Around the fence we could see now these real watchtowers which you never had in Westerbork with searchlights and machine guns. It was called the exchange camp, since we were exchange Jews.
But this was the end of their preferential treatment.
Schooling was forbidden in Belsen, playing was forbidden in Belsen, entertainment, which you had in Westerbork, was forbidden. I think everything was forbidden, and we just worked 6.5 days a week.
But it seemed freedom was not far away. On the 6th of June 1944, the Allies opened the Western Front. On D-Day, British, American, and Canadian troops landed on the beaches of Normandy. With them, a 1,500-strong brigade made up of Dutch soldiers who'd fled Holland in 1940. Even now, with the Allies closing in and with Mussert rejected by Hitler, he rallied his few remaining supporters and begged them to carry on fighting for Holland. The fight was soon on their doorstep. On the 13th of September, the first Dutch city, Maastricht, in the south of the country, was liberated by the Americans. And when BBC Radio Orangi prematurely reported the liberation of the southern town of Breda, thousands of NSB members fled to Germany. But Mussert stayed to face the music. Across much of the country, the Dutch began celebrating wildly, believing they too would soon be free. But a tragedy was just around the corner. Just 4 days later, Operation Market Garden was launched by the Allies. The plan was to grab key bridges across the rivers Meuse and Rhine and cut off the Ruhr, the German industrial heartland. Over 40,000 airborne troops were dropped, and the bridges at Nijmegen and Eindhoven were taken. Queen Wilhelmina expected a swift Allied victory, and in support called for a national rail strike to coincide with Market Garden and cut off supplies to the German army. Railway workers walked out, bringing the Dutch rail network to a halt. But the Queen's optimism was premature. The British Army found the crossing at Arnhem a bridge too far. They were defeated, and the Germans wanted revenge. They cut off supplies of coal, gas, electricity, food, and water. Shops ran out of food. Stoves and fires burnt out. The Dutch scavenged what they could. It marked the beginning of one of the worst human tragedies of the war. As the Allies counterattacked, the retreating Germans blew up dikes, holding back the North Sea. Fearing the whole of Holland might be flooded, the Allies held back their final assault. The Nazis would not retreat, and the Allies could not advance. The stalemate left the Dutch in the west of Holland cut off, freezing and starving. The Dutch would later brand the coming months the Hunger Winter. This famine claimed the lives of 16,000, who died of starvation and the cold. Caught up in it was a severely malnourished 15-year-old ballerina who spent the winter eating flour from crushed tulip bulbs to stay alive and dancing to raise money for the resistance. Audrey Hepburn would survive the war, but would blame the famine for chronic illness suffered later in her life. All the while his people starved, Anton Mussert did nothing. Eventually, it was the Allies who brought an end to their suffering.
The Germans had agreed to complete immunity for Allied planes in 10 dropping zones from 700 hours to 1,500 hours daily. However, some bomber crews noted rifle and light anti-aircraft fire. In contrast to the days when Nazi planes brought destruction to Rotterdam, Allied planes were now bringing Dutch cities sustenance.
The RAF and the Americans dropped 11,000 tons of food. But conditions remained desperate for the Oppenheimer family inside the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in Germany. Typhus had broken out, claiming the life of 15-year-old Anne Frank.
The Germans decided to bring the first survivors from Auschwitz to Bergen-Belsen, and more of those people came, and our camp became now overcrowded. We got lice, we got typhus, and now, of course, all these weak people started to die. Now my mum got ill, and she was put in a hospital barrack. But of course, by that time, there was chaos in the camp. There were no longer doctors or medicine or anything like that. A woman told me and the rest of the family that my mum had died. And of course, we were very upset about that. But then a few weeks later, my dad got ill, and he was put in a hospital barrack. And again, we visited him daily. But when we arrived there on the 20th of March, 1945, he was no longer lying in a bunk bed, and the guy who was lying there told me my dad had died.
By the spring of 1945, Germany's defeat was inevitable. Suddenly, Rudy, his brother and sister, were ordered out of the camp and onto another train. They were kept on the move so they might be traded for German prisoners of war. If only they'd stayed a few more days.
I gathered that 5 days after we left the railway ramp, we left it on the 10th of April 1945, the British Army entered the camp and liberated it. But of course, I wasn't there anymore.
From every corner of Europe, German troops are making the long trek back to the remains of their Third Reich. This contingent marches through Holland, whose people have felt the full weight of the Nazi jackboot.
On the 5th of May 1945, the commander of 117,000 German troops in Holland surrendered. The German army threw down their guns and marched home. Queen Wilhelmina returned to her country to rapturous crowds.
In every Scheldt town where bitter battles raged a few months ago, the people gathered to welcome their queen. Here, where the grey winter's war left scars, the queen talks to the humble people who never stopped fighting for their liberty.
After the victory came the reprisals. In Holland, over 120,000 were arrested for collaborating with the Nazis. Hundreds of women were beaten, had their heads shaved, and even painted orange for having relationships with Nazi soldiers. Men who'd fought with the Dutch SS were made to clear minefields. Anton Mussert was arrested on the 7th of May and charged with high treason. He was brought to a special court for trial at The Hague in November. And after just 2 days was found guilty and sentenced to death. Having lost an appeal, Mussert begged the Queen for clemency. She refused, and exactly a year to the day after his arrest, he was executed by firing squad. So what are we to make of Anton Mussert, the Dutch collaborator? As his country was invaded and its leaders fled, his defense was that he alone could be trusted to shield his people from the horrors of war. He promised to protect the Dutch, but he sent thousands of young men to their deaths fighting for the Nazis and was powerless to stop the slaughter in the Dutch East Indies. And having once openly embraced the Jews and their culture, he stood by as 107,000 of them were exterminated by the Nazis. In his attempts to reason with Hitler, he failed to grasp the demoniacal nature of the Nazi regime. For his failure to see the truth, he paid the ultimate price. Paul, Eve, and Rudi Oppenheimer were liberated by the Russians and were eventually found by their uncle and aunt. Had Eve Oppenheimer not been born in Britain and qualified her family as exchange Jews, it's more than likely all would have been gassed. Today, Rudi and Eve Oppenheimer both live in London. The story of Greece during the Nazi occupation is one of unthinkable suffering for its people. It was a time of terrible human sacrifice, heroic resistance, and collaboration. At the heart of the story was one man, Jonas Rallis, who led a puppet government installed by Adolf Hitler to do the Nazis' bidding. Rallis claimed he worked with the Nazis for one all-important reason: to prevent Greece from falling into the hands of communists. He even set up a brutal terror group, known as the Security Battalions, to hunt the communists down. But instead of saving Greece, he stood by as tens of thousands of Jews were deported to death camps. Whole villages were wiped out, and a devastating famine destroyed a tenth of the country's population. So what is the truth about Jonas Rallis? Was he a patriot who was trying to defend his people from what he thought was a greater evil? Was he a well-intentioned man who just got it wrong? Or was he a malicious collaborator?
He made a very strange kind of decision to collaborate with the German forces. He was an anti-communist to the point of collaboration.
At 61, Jonas Rallis was already in his twilight years at the outbreak of war. The son of a former Greek prime minister, he came from a family with a long tradition in political leadership. A moderate and a patriot, he had served in several governments until 1935.
Rallis was a member of a patrician kind of family of politicians in Athens. He was a conservative, a royalist. He wasn't a fascist. He wasn't prominent in any way, good or bad.
Then in 1936, there came an event that threw Greece into turmoil. The country fell into a state of chaos following a general election. The Communist Party was on the rise, threatening the stability of the king, George II, and the government. So the king ignored the election and turned to a man who he thought could beat down the communists, Ioannis Metaxas. A former minister of war, Metaxas modelled himself on Benito Mussolini, the dictator of Italy.
Arriverà al benessere, alla potenza e alla gloria.
Mussolini's fascist party and its armed militia, the Black Shirts, had already clashed with the communists in Italy and had successfully defeated them. Inspired by this, Metaxas now introduced the fascist salute and a Mussolini-style national youth movement. He made it quite clear that his would be a staunchly anti-communist dictatorship. He swiftly declared a state of emergency and closed down the Greek parliament and pronounced himself dictator. Rallis, who had once been a political ally of Metaxas, opposed this lurch towards fascism. At this stage, there was no inkling that this was a man who would ever collaborate with the Nazis. But before he could do anything about Metaxas, events occurred that would change everything. In September 1939, World War II began. The German war machine blasted its way into Poland. For the people of Greece, miles from the conflict, this must have seemed another world away. But they hadn't reckoned on the man Metaxas had so admired, Benito Mussolini. Although seen as a figure of fun today, he didn't seem that way back in 1939. He had one of the largest armies and navies in Europe. And he also had a plan to recreate the old Roman Empire, an empire that included Greece.
Ha valicato le onde dei secoli e la serie delle generazioni. Vai agli inermi!
On October the 28th, 1940, Mussolini made his move. Italian troops invaded Greece, attacking the north of the country from Albania. Metaxas was horrified at his hero's betrayal. He rejected an ultimatum that the Italians be allowed in to take over the country. But as the invasion got underway, Mussolini had not counted on the Greek army. Lacking tanks, the Greek army decided to hit the invading Italians on the run, in the mountains. It gave them a distinct advantage. In just 6 weeks, the Greeks scored a decisive victory as they pushed the Italians back into Albania.
Cold steel and the sheer determination to win. These were the deciding factors. And here the hardy Greek mountain troops with their formidable bayonets came into their own. Well done, Greece.
The victory for the Greek military is regarded to this day by many as the first Allied victory of the Second World War. It was the first signs of a resistance that would become legendary.
Poor Mussolini has got just a teeny suspicion he's made a mistake, saying the Mediterranean was an Italian lake. What a surprise for the Duce, he can't put it over the Greek.
To this day, the Greek rejection of the Italians' demands is still celebrated as a national holiday every year. Then in November 1940, the Royal Navy arrived in Greece bringing hundreds of British troops to support the Greek army. A declaration by the British government made a year earlier stated that in the event of a threat to Greek independence,
His Majesty's government would feel themselves bound at once to lend the Greek government all the support in their power.
At first, the British could only send a small force. Metaxas was keen to try and preserve his neutrality and not provoke Hitler. The British then added a number of Royal Air Force squadrons to the troops already in Greece. Their task was to help protect Greek cities, airfields and harbours from Italian air raids. Then, at the end of January 1941, Metaxas died. Churchill was now able to send a much bigger force to Greece. It consisted of 60,000 British, Australian and New Zealand troops. At this stage, Adolf Hitler had advanced plans to invade Russia. But having just seen his ally Mussolini humiliated, he decided to act.
Why did the Germans decide to invade Greece in spite of their plan to invade Russia or the Soviet Union at the time? Mainly because they were afraid of British aircraft stationed in Greece, that the Brits might and would most definitely bomb the oil fields of Romania, where the German forces had planned to refuel during their attack on the eastern part of the Soviet Union. I think that was the major reason.
On April the 6th, 1941, German forces launched a blitzkrieg on Greece. The Greek and British Commonwealth forces facing the Germans were overwhelmed and forced to retreat. Battered by constant air attacks and with the Germans hard on their heels, the Allied troops retreated to Greek ports to await evacuation. Before leaving, they destroyed as much of their equipment as they could. The majority managed to avoid capture, thanks to the Royal Navy. For those of mainland Greece, the war was over. On the 27th of April 1941, Hitler's troops marched into Athens. But still, the country did not surrender. Crete, a tactically important island in the Mediterranean, held out. Tens of thousands of Greek and Allied troops were stationed there. So Hitler ordered Operation Mercury, the largest airborne operation yet mounted. It began at dawn on May the 20th, 1941. 10,000 elite German paratroopers tumbled out of their low-flying transport planes over the north of the island. Their key objective was the airfield at Malomé, but they met stubborn resistance. Then, after 7 days of fighting, Crete finally fell. "10,000 Allied prisoners were taken, together with all their heavy weapons. The Germans too had suffered heavy losses, more than 3,000 paratroopers dead or missing. As a German general said, Crete had become the graveyard of the German paratroopers, and a disastrous victory.
It was a bloody mess. They lost most of their forces there, mainly because the Brits and the natives fought tooth and nail to keep the island. The native Cretans, who used all kinds of weapons, including pitchforks, waited for the Germans when they landed and they slaughtered them.
Greece was now completely in the hands of Hitler and his troops. Its government had fled, and the Allies had withdrawn. Greece was now occupied by three Axis forces: Italy, Germany, and Bulgaria. The Bulgarians took over the region of Thrace. The Germans occupied Salonika, Corinth, and the Aegean Islands and Crete. And the Italians took the rest, including the capital, Athens. For the Germans who now came flooding in, Greece was a kind of paradise. Many whiled away their time sightseeing. Swimming in the Aegean Sea became a popular pastime for the men and women of the German military. But the Germans also had a problem. They now had a country of 8 million people to run. With Germany fighting Britain in the west and about to invade Russia, they simply didn't have the manpower to rule Greece themselves. They needed a puppet government, manned by Greeks, who would do their bidding. Ioannis Rallis now watched as the first of a series of collaborationist governments was set up. The official line to the Greek people was that it was better to work with the Nazis rather than to continue fighting. That way, ordinary people could best be protected. But it was a claim that soon rung very hollow indeed. The Axis powers imposed what they called reconstruction fees, meaning that the Greek people had to pay for the cost of being invaded. As the Greek coffers were very low, the Nazis took payment in the form of crops and goods, food and materials that should have been feeding and clothing Greek men, women, and children.
I think the Germans looked at Greece as a country that should be looted, practically. They tried to extract as much as they could out of this country, and mainly they looted foodstuff, and therefore deprived the population from basic foodstuff.
The lack of food was made even worse by the Allies. They were blockading Greece to starve out the Axis forces. The result became known as the Great Famine. As winter closed in, Greeks living in the cities found they couldn't get food. People were reduced to scavenging in bomb sites for anything to eat.
The winter of 1942 was absolutely disastrous. People just dropped in the streets. I remember my parents were telling me that they went to church one day and the church had this strange odor. And they realized that bodies were being stacked into the church and in a decaying state of affairs. And this was commonplace. It happened every day, practically, that winter. Something in the vicinity of 400,000 or maybe 500,000 dead was incurred because of lack of food.
As their people starved, the collaborationist politicians did nothing. But others did. Resistance movements began springing up, mainly in the countryside and the mountains. These resistance groups reflected the fractured nature of Greek politics. Nationalist, liberal, socialist and communist fighters all began vying for power. The largest resistance group to emerge was the National Liberation Front, the EAM. It was made up largely of communists and had its own military wing, known as Hellas.
The only organized force in Greece, organized in clandestine, let's say, activities, was the Communist Party. They had been under Metaxas's constant harassment. Many were imprisoned, and when the Germans entered Greece, prisons were, even before the Germans entered Greece, prisons were opened and people were let free. Many of these people who were once interned and were being under surveillance became the leaders of the new resistance force.
The main rival to the communist Hellas group was the right-wing National Republican Greek League, known as EDIS. The two rival groups clashed often as their ideologies went head-to-head. But they did at least have one common cause. They loathed the occupying Germans, Italians, and Bulgarians, and they would stop at nothing to drive them out. One way to strike a blow against the Axis forces was to attack their supply lines. Greece was a crucial route for the Germans supporting their troops in North Africa. Sever those lines, and it would be a major step in bringing the German war machine to a halt. The British soon realized that if they could get the resistance movements on side, it could prove decisive. So they selected a team from the SOE, the Special Operations Executive. They were highly trained specialists who carried out secret and daring missions. Experts in espionage and surveillance. Their speciality was sabotage behind enemy lines. On the night of November the 25th, 1942, an SOE unit was parachuted into Greece. It met up with both communist-backed Hellas and nationalist EDIS fighters operating in the Greek mountains.
The British believed that the more damage the resistance forces did against the Germans, the better for the cause of the war. So they didn't really differentiate initially between left and right, who was communist or non-communist. They gave money to both sides, they tried to help both sides. In time, they realized that there was another war going on, and that was between the Communist Party and the other resistance forces.
Amazingly, the SOE team persuaded the two groups to work together. Their first mission was codenamed Operation Harling. Its target was the giant railway viaduct at Gorgopotamus. The bridge was part of a major supply line linking Thessalonica in the north and Athens in the south. Guerrillas from the two groups, along with members of the British Special Operations Team, attacked the viaduct and blew it up. The mission was a spectacular success. The vital viaduct was out of action for months. But it was the only time the two opposing guerrilla groups ever managed to cooperate. Italian and German troops were now sent out to put down the resistance. Their methods were vicious. For any Greek fighters who were caught, there could only be one outcome. Again, the collaborationist regime stood by and let it happen, as did Rallis. And the claim that they had only taken power in order to protect the Greek people would look even less convincing because of events elsewhere in the country. The city of Thessalonica had one of the most vibrant Jewish communities in Europe. There were 50,000 Sephardic Jews living in the city at the outbreak of World War II. For years, they had lived peacefully side by side with Greek Christians. But then the Germans arrived. Almost immediately, they began imposing anti-Jewish measures. Jewish newspapers were closed down. Jews were forced to wear a yellow Star of David. And Jewish families were forcibly removed from their homes. All the while, the collaborationist government did nothing to help them. In July 1942, all Jewish adult males in Thessalonica were ordered to report to the city's main square to register for compulsory labor. Deprived of any shade, they were made to perform exercises by their SS captors. Any Jews unable to do the exercises were insulted and beaten. And it would get far worse. In December 1942, the main Jewish cemetery in Thessalonica was destroyed. The following March, the city's entire Jewish community was crammed into railway boxcars, along with Jews from Thrace, the part of Greece occupied by Hitler's Bulgarian allies. A total of 60,000 men, women, and children were then sent in terrible conditions to Poland. There they died, in the gas chambers at Auschwitz and Treblinka. Almost the entire Jewish community of Thessalonica was wiped out. While the collaborationist ministers were guilty mainly of doing nothing, soon they and Rallis would become actively implicated in Nazi crimes. By April 1943, the resistance to the occupiers was growing. The Germans decided to turn to the one Greek they thought could help them deal with the guerrillas, Ioannis Rallis. He now became Prime Minister.
They appoint collaboration governments. The third was under Ioannis Rallis, a politician of the royalist variety, the populist or People's Party variety, who understood very well that the war was more or less ending at the expense of Germany, but he feared the takeover by the communist-led resistance forces. So his major, I think, concern was to prepare Greece for the post-war state of affairs. But he was nevertheless in cahoots with the Germans.
Rallis was right about one thing. By the time he came to power, the German army was indeed in trouble. In Russia, its army was trapped in Stalingrad. In North Africa, its forces were now close to defeat. it couldn't fight on two major fronts and deal with Greek guerrillas. So it asked Rallis to form his own army. And he did. Rallis set up units known as security battalions.
The security battalions were mostly thugs that would brutalize people who were considered friends or left-leaning people, or friends of the Communist Party, or simply disinterested in giving information, or shirked from giving information against their fellow citizens. So they were not well liked by the population, obviously.
Armed and trained by the Nazis, the mission of the security battalions was to liquidate the resistance groups in the Greek countryside. On the face of it, this was a patriotic movement designed to combat communism. And the security battalions did prove popular. 22,000 men volunteered. But any idea that they were fighting for Greece was quickly dispelled. On joining up, each member had to swear an oath of loyalty not to Greece, but to Adolf Hitler. Rallis objected to the oath on the grounds that Greek military forces couldn't put themselves in the hands of a foreign government. But he was simply ignored. By the time Rallis became prime minister, the communist-dominated Hellas had already gained control of a third of the country. Rallis was now in the bizarre position of being a Greek patriot, providing Greek soldiers to attack Greek freedom fighters. And Rallis's position would soon become even more invidious. For the Nazis would make him complicit in their greatest crime of all, the Holocaust. In 1943, the Jewish community in the capital city of Athens suddenly came under threat, right on Rallis's doorstep.
The Allied invasion operations began from the beaches of the Axis Sicilian stronghold. Operations which are now nearing completion, which resulted in the downfall of Benito Mussolini, and which will go forward until Italy and then Germany lay down their arms with unconditional surrender.
Ironically, it was a series of Allied victories that led to the Germans turning on the Athenian Jews. In the summer of 1943, the Allies had landed in Sicily. They fought their way up through southern Italy, and by September, Mussolini's regime had collapsed. Italy, in effect, now changed sides and joined the Allies. Hitler had to act fast. Right across France, Yugoslavia, and Greece, German troops disarmed their former Italian friends. They now seized control of territories that had previously been occupied by the Italians. By the end of October 1943, the Germans had regained control over the Aegean, including Athens. Now the city's Jews lay at their mercy.
The Germans take over all the territories under Italian occupation, including Athens, and that is where the Jews of Athens are threatened with extinction because their turn would come with the Germans. The Italians were less severe in persecuting the Jews as opposed to the Germans. Fortunately, the Athenian Jews were old Jews. They were from Roman times. They spoke the Greek language and they were not distinguishable.
But still the Nazis stepped up the pressure on the city's Jewish community, demanding that the Greek authorities help round them up. Many Greek police officers simply ignored instructions to arrest Jews and turn them over to the Germans. The Archbishop of Athens and Greece, Damaskinos Papandreou, also defied the Nazis. He instructed his priests to get their congregations to rescue Jews. He also sent a strongly worded letter of protest to Prime Minister Rallis and to the Germans. Rallis himself was no anti-Semite, but he was caught in a trap, eager to work with the Nazis to defeat communism. He tried to tread a fine line. In public, he supported the Nazis' anti-Jewish measures. In private, though, he didn't punish fellow Greeks for defying them. It gained him few friends. To escape persecution, many Athenian Jews headed for the mountains to join the partisans. Others left the city by boat. Many went into hiding. But by the end of the war, around 800 Athenian Jews had been rounded up and sent to Auschwitz. But it wasn't just the Jewish population which was a target for the German troops that had taken over the areas once occupied by the Italians. The Germans now gave orders to crush the Greek resistance.
All armed men are to be shot on the spot. Villages from where shots have been fired or where armed men have been encountered are to be destroyed, and the men of the village are to be shot.
The Germans took heavy reprisals. It was their policy to do so. They would kill, let's say, 20, 50 Greeks for one German soldier or officer, even more. So reprisals was in line for any attack against the Germans.
If the Germans couldn't find the perpetrators, then they would turn on ordinary villagers. They would be arrested and publicly executed. These reprisals set ordinary Greeks against the resistance.
How does one explain to the rest of society that we kill one German and then we have 50 or 20, whatever, Greeks shot for that? Hence, we had many occasions when the Germans practically eradicated villages in order to make them an example, to set an example for other resistance activities.
In December 1943, the bloodiest massacre on Greek soil during World War II took place. After LS forces had killed 81 German soldiers, a German unit was dispatched to the town of Collaborators in the Peloponnese. When they reached the town, they locked all women and children in the local school. They then ordered all men and boys over 12 to a hill overlooking the village. There, the German troops machine-gunned them down. 696 men and boys were massacred. Only a handful survived to tell the tale. Then the German troops set about destroying the entire village, burning every building. Today in Collaborators, there is a memorial to those who were slaughtered. It's called the Place of Sacrifice, and the events of that fateful day in December 1943 are still commemorated every year. But if they thought these atrocities would stop the resistance, the Germans were wrong. The guerrillas kept attacking them, and the Germans kept burning villages. By the end of the war, hundreds of Greek villages had been destroyed. These attacks were a disaster for Rallis. What little credibility he had as a protector of his people was lost. But again, instead of saying anything, he just stood by and did nothing. By now in Russia, the Germans were on the run. In the west, the Allies had landed at Normandy. An Allied invasion of Greece seemed only weeks away. The majority of Greeks were looking forward to the day of their liberation. For the Germans in Greece, it was time to get ready for a last-ditch defense of the fatherland. This meant protecting the roads and railways, which they would use to withdraw to Germany. For Rallis, this could have been a time for him to have distanced himself. He could have resigned as Prime Minister and saved something of his reputation. Instead, he chose to continue his collaboration. He still believed it was his duty to destroy the communists. And for him, the only route to achieve his aim was with the Germans. In August 1944, the Soviet army burst into the Balkans, swiftly overrunning Romania and forcing Bulgaria to sue for peace. The Bulgarian forces in northern Greece immediately disintegrated. The Germans were now in danger of being cut off from their homeland. They began to retreat north. Along the way, they left a trail of devastation.
Well, the first thing the Germans did while withdrawing was to demolish everything they could demolish. They blew up all railroad stations that they could do so. They destroyed power companies, everything. So Greece was in total shambles after that.
Key targets were strategic installations like the Corinth Canal. Months, if not years, would pass before they could be used again. One of the Germans' last acts in Athens was to remove the swastika flag that had flown from the Acropolis. At the same time, the premiership of Ioannis Rallis finally came to a quiet and inglorious end. On October the 16th, 1944, British and Greek forces landed in Greek ports. Final proof that 4 years of Axis oppression and cruelty were finally over.
Carpets are spread in the street in front of the jeeps, and they are bombarded with flowers and fruit. Corinth, cleared of the enemy, receives with overwhelming enthusiasm the Greek and British troops.
The return of the British also brought the guerrilla groups into the Greek capital. Though they'd spent most of their time fighting the Germans in the mountains, they'd also been fighting each other, with the communist-backed Hellas jockeying for position to take control of the country after the war.
It's a rather complicated state of affairs because there were several wars being fought simultaneously. One was against the occupying forces by everybody, and then there was a war between the resistance movements for the future of Greece after the war. Who would take over the country after the war? Would it be a Republican regime? Would it be a royalist democracy, or would it be a communist-led regime?
For 2 months, an uneasy calm existed between British forces on the Greek mainland and Hellas. But then early in December 1944, the one thing Rallis had been afraid of finally happened. Hellas forces rose up in Athens and attempted to seize control. It meant a new war, this time communists against the British. Churchill ordered British troops to crush the Hellas uprising.
Look at these pictures. British soldiers, comrades of the men who fought with Greeks against the Hun, are here engaged in fighting those same men. Airborne troops occupying a rooftop position fire their machine gun into a street of Athens to prevent the movement of Hellas forces.
Churchill went to Athens to oversee the creation of a pro-British government. The man he chose to lead it was Archbishop Damaskinos, who had done so much to protect Greek Jews from the Nazis. Now, a fierce battle began. The British unleashed a concentrated attack on the communist forces. RAF planes were even sent to attack their strongholds in the capital. After several weeks, the communist guerrillas were defeated. Archbishop Damaskinos and his government could at last establish itself. Order was restored, but it didn't last long.
A forward battalion moves up, and there goes the signal for the attack. Every type of modern weapon is brought into play as the bitter warfare surges back and forth over the desolate mountain passes.
In 1946, Greek communists once more took up arms. A fully fledged civil war broke out. It lasted 3 years and cost the lives of thousands of people. To end the civil war, the Greek government turned to the men who had served in Rallis's security battalions. They were released from prison to join Greek government forces fighting the communists. Eventually, in 1949, the civil war subsided. Greece remained free from communism. By then, Ioannis Rallis was a forgotten relic of the past. He was tried as a Nazi collaborator in 1946 and sentenced to life in prison. Rallis's defense to his people was that he was right to fear communism. The uprisings after the war and the lives they cost certainly seem to be proof of that. But does fear of communism justify standing by when over 500,000 ordinary Greeks were starved to death? Does it justify supporting the Nazis' policy of transporting the Jews to the death camps? In terms of percentage of the population, Greece suffered amongst the worst of any country in World War II. Over 800,000 people, that's 10% of Greece's pre-war population, perished. And of course, in the end, communism, the thing Ioannis Rallis most feared, was defeated not by the Nazis, but by the Western Allies.
His driving force was mainly anti-communist. He was an anti-communist to the point of collaboration. That was his main fault. He ought to have realized that during that period, being an anti-communist didn't mean what it might have meant 10 years later. It meant that he made a very silly kind of, or strange kind of decision to collaborate with the German forces. And the German forces were the ogre It wasn't anyone else then, it was the Germans who starved 500,000 Greeks to death.
It's hardly surprising, then, that Ioannis Rallis died in 1946, just 1 year after being imprisoned, a lonely and forgotten figure. Helsinki, Finland. The prosperous, confident capital of a prosperous, confident country. Much of this prosperity can be traced back to World War II, where this small country battled against the odds to survive and lay the foundations for its current economic success. But what you don't see emphasized on the war monuments is that for most of this war, the Finns fought not on the side of the Allies, but on the side of the Nazis. And amongst the prominent Finns that gave their full support for this was Finland's greatest hero, Marshal Mannerheim. The Finns justify this collaboration by saying that the alternative was to be swallowed up by communist Russia. But is this true? Was Mannerheim right to advocate fighting alongside Nazi Germany? Is it indeed possible to justify collaborating with the most evil regime in history? Could the Finns be that rare thing? Good collaborators? September 1939. War is declared. Germany and Russia invade Poland in a deal to split the conquered country in two and share the spoils. But in the north, Russia saw the chance to settle a long-standing grudge with an old enemy, Finland. Finland had been independent from Russia for just 22 years. Now the Russians wanted it back. In November 1939, Helsinki is attacked by Russian aircraft. "400,000 Russian soldiers pour over the border. At the start of what became known as the Winter War, there seemed to be no contest. The Russian forces massively outnumbered the Finns. Their generals confidently predicted a victory in 10 to 15 days. Finland, after all, was only a small nation of just 3.5 million people. 80% of their forces weren't professional soldiers, but volunteers. The Finns lacked key military equipment like tanks and had just 2 weeks' supply of ammunition. But Finland did have 2 secret weapons. The 1939 winter was exceptionally cold, which the Finns could use to their advantage. They also had a commander who knew the Russians like the back of his hand. Carl Gustav Mannerheim had served for 30 years in the Imperial Russian Army. He had then returned to Finland to lead the country to independence after a bloody civil war. Now this cigar-smoking aristocrat was back in charge of the Finnish army at the age of 72. It was Mannerheim's sure grasp of the tactics and strategy a small nation could use against a much larger aggressor that now would make all the difference. In the years leading up to the war, he had concentrated on building a series of trenches in the disputed Karelian Isthmus to the south of the country near Russia. Now those new defenses, which became known as the Mannerheim Lines, were being put to the test as the Russians advanced ever deeper. They worked. They held back the Red Army for a crucial 46 days of unrelenting pressure. And Mannerheim wasn't content just to defend. He organized small bands of soldiers, often lightly equipped on skis, who soon got the measure of the Russians. They used the terrain of forest, lakes, and wood to frustrate and trap the Red Army. This land may look beautiful now, but 50 years ago, it was a killing field. A favorite tactic of Mannerheim's was to trap the long Russian armored columns by attacking the convoys at the front, in the middle, and at the rear. The Finns then set about killing the remaining Russians in lightning attacks from all quarters. And if the Finns didn't get the Russian conscripts, the weather did. The fortunate were captured. Others froze to death. 200,000 of them. But despite these early Finnish successes, Mannerheim knew that the might of the Red Army would eventually win through. So in March 1940, he urged a battered and exhausted Finland to sue for peace with Russia. The result was a treaty in which it had to surrender much of Karelia, including its second largest city, Viipuri. "400,000 refugees fled into what remained of Finland. Many Finns felt betrayed, but Mannerheim stressed that their troops had done well, and at least Finland had not been conquered. But it was a very dark time, and it could only get worse. Mannerheim knew he needed help. The Russians were bound to come back. They always did, because Finland and Russia shared a long and savage history. For 100 years, Finland had been ruled as part of the old imperial territories of the Russian Tsar. Finnish independence seemed simply a dream. But then in 1917, towards the end of the First World War, imperialist Russia collapsed under the communist revolution. Finland became an independent nation. It was, though, too good to be true. The new communist rulers of Russia encouraged the Finnish working class to rise up and establish a Finnish communist state. Finland divided between the left, the communist Reds, and the right, the nationalist Whites. Civil war became inevitable. the Reds took over Helsinki and looked to Russia for help and support. The Whites regrouped in the country and looked instead for help to an old friend, Germany. After several months of very bloody battles, the White nationalists, led by the virulently anti-communist Mannerheim, triumphed. Over 80,000 Red sympathizers were interned, some in islands around Helsinki, in appalling conditions. 11,000 of them perished. The Whites had triumphed, but it was a triumph that was due not only to Mannerheim, but also to the German army, who in April 1918 helped take back Helsinki. It was a lesson all Finnish nationalists learned. Finland was free, and this latest Russian threat had been resisted, but they had needed German help. Ten years later, the Russian threat returned. The Great Depression caused the financial meltdown of the whole continent. In the descent into social unrest and industrial disarray, Finland was not immune. Millions lost their jobs. Communism became attractive once again, especially to the working class and the poor. In elections all across Europe, the communist parties gained ground. In 1929 in Finland, they won 14% of the vote. Deep in the Finnish countryside, many were appalled. This rise in communism meant just one thing: the return of the Russians. Finnish farmers became the backbone of Lapur, a nationalist movement formed in 1929 dedicated to the eradication of communism. Its most prominent supporter was Gustav Mannerheim. After the Civil War ended in 1918, Mannerheim had retired to an elegant wooden house in the most expensive part of Helsinki. There he entertained and stored all the many trophies he'd acquired in his travels. Today it's a museum kept in the elegant style in which he lived. Although his bedroom reflects the soldier he always remained in his heart. But the rise in communism at the end of the 1920s persuaded him to return to public life and start hunting different kinds of prey.
He did not like the complete politics of the Lappo movement, but of course he did not accept the communist ideals, and that was the reason why he more sympathized with the Lappo.
Lapur persuaded the government to outlaw communism, but it then went much further, using terror and intimidation against anyone who opposed their vision of Finland. In 1932, Lapur was banned, but soon another right-wing party emerged, taking inspiration from Nazi Germany. The People's Patriotic Movement consciously copied elements of Hitler's political thinking, notably the national community, where the individual is secondary to the fatherland. Its newspaper called for a Finnish Hitler, and there was only one person they had in mind: For Mannerheim and Finland, it was a crucial moment. He had to choose between a Finnish democracy, whose weakness he despised, and a nationalist movement which shared his hatred of communism, but also was close to an ideology he feared as much as admired: Nazism. Mannerheim chose democracy. He decided the best way for Finland to resist the Russians was for him to stay out of politics and reorganize and rearm the Finnish army. The Winter War of 1939 proved him right. The Finnish army's resistance had stopped Russia taking back all of Finland, at least for now. It gave Mannerheim time. Time to find an ally who could help defeat the Russians when they inevitably returned. But who should they turn to? Mannerheim's preference was for the Western allies, particularly Britain and France. In the Winter War, the British cabinet had discussed sending a Franco-British volunteer force. But the Baltic Sea was controlled by the Germans, and in the end, it came to nothing. The 12,000 volunteers from all around the world who did make it to Finland included only a handful of British and French citizens. The option of a successful collaboration with the British and French seemed highly improbable. There was, however, another option: Finland's old friend Germany. The only problem was that this was a very different Germany. It was now controlled by Hitler and the Nazis. The Nazis had agreed a pact with the Soviet Union and stayed neutral in the Winter War. But everyone knew this pact was cynical, and Hitler started conceiving the idea that his Russian ally would soon become his enemy. He was determined to strike first by preparing in secret an invasion. One key to a successful invasion would be taking the city of Leningrad. And to make sure of that, Hitler needed the Finns. In August 1940, Mannerheim received a letter from Hermann Goering, the most senior of all Hitler's commanders, requesting permission for German troops to cross Finnish soil. Granting permission would open the floodgates to cooperation and collaboration. It was a crucial moment. Mannerheim's flirtation with Lepore and Finnish nationalism in the 1930s had given him a distaste for fascism, and he knew dealing with the Nazis would destroy his international reputation forever. Yet the Winter War had made the Finnish people weary and hungry. The country was collapsing and needed aid. Aid only Germany could deliver. As Mannerheim pondered his decision, the pro-German movement in Finland grew stronger. Particularly influential was the new rector of Helsinki University, Ralph Nevanlinna. Nevanlinna had made his name not in the world of politics, but in mathematics. In the 1920s, he developed what is still known today as Nevanlinna theory, a major contribution to function theory, the classical mathematics which emerged from the calculus of Newton and Leibniz.
In the first half of the 20th century, he was certainly one of the most famous mathematicians in the world.
In the 1930s, Nevanlinna's interests turned to politics and nationalism. He supported Lepore. And in Germany, the center of world mathematics and the country where his mother was born, he looked approvingly at the rise of Hitler and National Socialism.
Well, he sympathized it. He had many relatives in Germany because of his mother. So uncles and so close relatives. And their reports were positive. So I think he was happy to see the rise of Germany.
Nevenlina travelled frequently to Germany, supporting academic events and conferences organised by the Nazi government. He became known as a sympathetic friend of the Third Reich, openly praising their achievements and singling out Goering for a special mention.
He gave a speech in Finnish radio in the fall of 1940. He praised the German armed forces of their successes in Europe and especially Nazi ideology.
Although Nevenlina's enthusiasm for the Nazis wasn't widely shared in Finland, it was extremely influential. It was clear that given a choice between Russian communism and the Nazis, most Finns would choose the Nazis. So Mannerheim did the deal he knew would go down well with his fellow countrymen and women. With his ally, the new Finnish president, Risto Ryti, the Finns would cooperate with Nazi Germany. The result was felt straight away. Ammunition, oil, coal, fertilizers, grain and meat flooded into the country brought in by German troops to enthusiastic receptions from Finns all across the land. Finland had made it clear that the Finns would not be collaborators with the Nazis, but co-belligerents, fighting on the same side against a common enemy, Soviet Russia. But the reality was more complex. There was a price which Finland had to pay for Nazi help. Mannerheim and Ryti had to make several crucial concessions to the Nazis that went way beyond co-belligerency and which stepped over the line to collaboration. They allowed Finnish troops who were fighting the Russians in northern Finland to come under German command. And amongst the 200,000 German troops that now moved into Finland, the Finnish government turned a blind eye to soldiers from the armed wing of the Nazi Party, the SS. The SS had been formed in 1925 as a personal protection unit for Adolf Hitler. Under the leadership of Heinrich Himmler, it had grown into one of the largest and most powerful organizations in the Third Reich. SS soldiers swore personal allegiance to Hitler and fought unquestionably for his ideology. They were responsible too for many of the atrocities carried out under the Nazi regime. In particular, the Holocaust. There was no Holocaust in Finland. The German SS officers were allowed a pretty free rein to interrogate political radicals and prisoners, especially those who were Jewish. But it was the final concession made by Mannerheim and Ryti to the Nazis that would prove the most troublesome. The Finns agreed to the German request to recruit volunteers to join the Waffen-SS on the Eastern Front. Amongst these volunteers was Konstantin Kandi.
Minulla oli tulossa niin kuin asevelvollisuusaika vuonna 1941 lokakuussa, mutta silloin toukokuun aikana selvisi tieto, että Saksaan armeijaa pääsisi palvelemaan noin 8 vuodeksi. niin me emme tienneet sitä, että me joudumme niin sanottuja Waffen-SS-osastoihin.
Mannerheim and Ritty realized that providing soldiers like Konstantin Kandy to the Waffen-SS would not only be a great propaganda triumph for the Nazis, it would take them across the line from being co-belligerents, fighting the same enemy, to active collaborators. So they did everything they could to limit the damage and cover their tracks. The Finnish SS battalion could only fight against Russia, not against the other allies. Their recruitment would be done not by the government, but at arm's length by Finns like mathematician Ralph Nevenlina, known for their Nazi sympathies, and who could be blamed if anything went wrong. And the raw recruits were described not as soldiers, but as industrial workers when they were sent to SS training schools. Not that the training left any doubt about their role.
Siellä kuri oli kova. Siellä joutui ryömimään yli aitojen ja aliaitojen ja ampumarata oli alusta lähtien kova panos. Ammunta, konekiväärillä ammuttiin. Ei mitään paukkupatrunoita, vaan kovia patrunoita. Silloin kun tämä pataljoona sitten sai tällaisen niin kuin, valmis lähtemään rintamalle, niin silloin oli 15. päivä syyskuuta 1942. Pataljoona oli kerätty niin kuin avoneliöön ja siellä vannottiin Hitlerille, nimenomaan Hitlerille, valaa.
Once they had sworn their oaths, they were then ready to take part in the Nazis' latest and most daring military plan, Operation Barbarossa. In August 1941, German panzers drove deep into Russia, catching Stalin, their former ally, completely by surprise. The German army was soon well on the way to Leningrad. And there was another surprise for the Russians. Up in Finland, Mannerheim seized his opportunity. He launched his own attack on Russia to regain the land that was lost at the end of the Winter War. With the Red Army preoccupied with the German attack inside Russia, the Finnish troops managed to quickly capture all the territory conceded. Even the battered city, Viipuri. But at the old Russian-Finnish border, Mannerheim stopped his troops and ordered them to go no further. Despite German pleas, attacking Leningrad was a line of collaboration he was not prepared to cross. Mannerheim realized that if the Finns joined in with the German troops who were attacking Leningrad from the south, they would become aggressors. They would no longer be able to claim that Finland was involved in a defensive war, simply to take back Finnish territory. But now there was another unexpected problem that the Finnish government had to deal with. What to do with the Russian prisoners of war and displaced civilians who now came under Finnish control? Unlike the Germans, the Finns treated many of them well, but not all. In the last few years, historians and journalists like Boris Salomon have started investigating what really went on during the period of cooperation with the Nazis. They're uncovering stories which reveal that this cooperation had its dark side, which in Finland has often been denied or forgotten, such as the treatment of prisoners, displaced civilians, and refugees when the Finns took over eastern Karelia.
Gab Lager, Internierungslager, das in vielen dem System ähnelte, das die Deutschen in den besetzten Gebieten der Sowjetunion installiert hatten.
In one camp in the summer of 1942, over 3,000 Russians died of malnutrition.
Der große Gedanke war ja, eine Siedlungsaktion vorzunehmen. Das heißt, sozusagen die slawischen Anteile der Bevölkerung zu verdrängen und durch finnische Siedler zu ersetzen.
After the war, several prison wardens and officers were tried and found guilty of crimes against humanity. But at the time, nobody cared. Not even Mannerheim, who was focused instead on how well the war was going. Meanwhile, 200 miles south from Mannerheim's Finnish army, now stationary on the Russian border, the Finnish SS volunteers were deep inside Russia, fighting alongside the German army on the Eastern Front. They proved to be magnificent warriors, often against the odds. They were involved in the savage siege of Leningrad, and they then fought for the oil fields of Grozny as part of Hitler's push to Stalingrad. The Finnish volunteers' bravery earned the division many German medals, but at great personal cost. Over 500 of them were wounded. 200 lost their lives.
Minun ryhmäjohtaja kaatui minun vieressä ja luoti meni tästä läpi ja ei saanut häntä pois sieltä ja hän jää sitten sinne vihollisen puolelle tavallaan. Oberchauffeur Repp, sen nimi oli. Alanne kuoli jouluna. Pentti Koivisto kuoli jouluna.
But although they were part of the SS, the Finnish survivors claim to this day that they never took part in any atrocities or war crimes, and certainly not in the SS leader Heinrich Himmler's most murderous policy, the Holocaust.
Ja samaten meidän pataljoona ei myöskään syyllistynyt mihinkään tällaisiin sotarikoksiin, jotka taas olivat sellainen ruma tapa, ikävä tapa näille koti-SS-osastoilla. Ja ottakaa huomioon, että näissä SS, jotka olivat tässä teloitushommissa, suurin osa, erittäin suuri osa oli Baltian virolaisia, liettualaisia, latvialaisia.
And this has been the accepted opinion in Finland for the last 50 years. But now these accounts are being questioned too. The Finnish soldiers were, after all, fully part of the Waffen-SS.
Also man hat also nachweisen können, dass also Waffen-SS-Einheiten an Mordtaten in Lidice teilgenommen haben und auch in Frankreich Menschen ermordet haben. Das heißt, es gibt diese Einstufung, nämlich kriminelle Organisationen. Man kann belegen, dass auch Finnen, die im Raum Kaukasus gekämpft haben, durchaus an Tötungen teilgenommen haben. An Tötungen, ich meine jetzt an Zivilpersonen.
Boris Salomon says that in at least one fully documented case, in Poland in June 1941, a Finnish SS soldier witnessed an execution of Jews. He thinks there may well be other cases. But this is strongly denied by the SS veterans still alive today. They say they neither witnessed nor participated in any such crime, nor did any Finn they knew. There was one man, though, who gradually realized the potential for disaster the Finnish SS division might prove. In Finland today, you can't escape tributes to Carl Gustav Mannerheim. Not only does his statue dominate downtown Helsinki, the most important street in the capital is named after him. And in the house where he once lived, alongside his preserved furniture, you can now buy your very own Mannerheim bust, a bargain at €25. But one event that is not recorded here is Mannerheim's 75th birthday in August 1942, when he received a very famous, although not entirely welcome, last-minute visitor.
He was never a friend of Hitler, and he didn't want to make close friendship with him.
But at the time, the Führer certainly wanted to be friends with Mannerheim, or at least make sure the rest of the world saw him as a friend. So Hitler insisted his film unit recorded every step of his trip to give Mannerheim his birthday wishes.
Aterrizaje en un aeródromo detrás del frente finlandés. Recibe al Führer el presidente del Estado finlandés, Ryti.
But the Führer wasn't here just for a birthday party. There were one or two key problems with the German-Finnish cooperation on Hitler's mind, which was the real reason he made the trip. He needed a deal. A deal which involved Mannerheim agreeing to move the Finnish army into Russia, helping the German army secure Leningrad. And a deal which enabled him to keep the Finnish SS volunteers fighting with the German army in Russia and not recall them home. Mannerheim relished his moment of power, even doing something people rarely did in front of the Führer. Hitler hated smoking.
After the lunch, he lit his cigar, and all the officers of the Hitler companions, they were quite pale when they saw that, but they couldn't say anything, and Hitler did not say anything.
Mannerheim could sense that the war was on the turn, and that things were beginning to slip away from Germany. He wanted out. So he insisted that despite Hitler's wishes, the Finnish SS volunteers should be recalled from Russia, and the men integrated into the regular Finnish army on the Russian border. That didn't please the Germans at all. They turned to an old Finnish friend. With German approval, Professor Rolf Nevenlina became chair of a new committee designed to win public support for the Finnish SS. He had regular meetings with the volunteers, made frequent visits to Berlin, and lobbied hard. But Mannerheim wouldn't give way, and eventually the head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, recognized defeat. Today, I release you from the service to the Waffen-SS. I thank you for your courageous service, that you have provided to the glory and honor of your beautiful motherland in a German soldier's uniform. You have just as much contributed to the victory against your and our age-old enemy Russia and against Bolshevism as your German SS comrades. By the summer of 1943, most of the Finnish SS battalion had been recalled, although over 100 did volunteer to stay on and fight as part of German units. Many of the battalion that made their way home joined the regular Finnish army under Mannerheim, now in stalemate with the resurgent Russians. But extracting Finland from the SS was relatively easy. Much more difficult was bringing an end to the war against Russia, not least because there were still hundreds of thousands of German troops on Finnish soil. Yet it was clear that this collaboration with the Nazis had to stop if Finland wasn't to find itself on the losing side at the end of the war. As the Nazis started experiencing a series of defeats and setbacks, so the Finns began slowly winding down their confrontations with the Russians in the north. By the end of 1943, they were refusing to take part in any offensive military operations that might help Germany. The trouble was, the Russians had another agenda. As they drove the Nazis out of Russia, so the Red Army targeted the Finnish front as part of a new initiative against Germany called Operation Bagration. Within days, the Russians had pushed the Finnish army back and were heading towards Viipuri. Soon the Finns would be steamrolled by their arch-enemy. Once more, the Finns needed help, and the only possible help was the friend that Ritti and Mannerheim were trying to get away from, Nazi Germany. So they hatched a daring plan. In return for Nazi support, President Ritti gave a personal undertaking not to pursue a separate peace with Russia. But what Mannerheim and Ritti knew well was that this presidential agreement, while perfectly lawful in Nazi Germany, was illegal in Finland, because it hadn't been approved by the Finnish parliament. Mannerheim and Ritti tricked the Nazis into signing an accord which they could get out of any time they wanted. The Germans rushed troops and anti-tank weapons to the rescue of the Finns. And in June and July 1944, Finland fought one last epic battle with Russia. 150,000 Russians faced 50,000 Finns. In an area spanning 40 square miles, the two sides' artillery pounded each other relentlessly. The Finns were fighting for their country's very survival. But they held on. "600 Russian tanks were destroyed, many with German-supplied weapons. Up to 20,000 Russian troops were killed. The battle was hugely important. The Finns had proved to the Russians they were a force to be reckoned with. They would fiercely resist all attempts by the Red Army to conquer them, and they had shown that the price of capturing Finland would be far too high. Most crucially, the Finns had forced Stalin to revise his policy. He opted for a separate armistice with Finland, a unique concession that no other former German ally would receive. None of this would have been possible without German support. The deal with Germany had secured Finland's future. And now the Finns would repay the Germans by going back on what they had promised. They claimed that they weren't bound by President Risto Riti's personal agreement not to agree a separate peace with Russia, because Ryti hadn't got Parliament's support and so had acted illegally. Ryti resigned. Mannerheim took over as president and was able to negotiate a separate peace between Finland and Russia without reference to Germany. Just as Mannerheim and Ryti had planned months before, the Nazis were now out in the cold. Finland may have lost the war, but it had survived. True, the Russians did insist on keeping all the territory they had won in the Winter War, including Viipuri, Finland's second city, now known as the Russian city of Viborg. But Finland, unlike the other Baltic states, remained free of communism. There was, however, a price to pay. In Helsinki today, there is a memorial for President Risto Ryti, who is now seen as a hero. But in 1946, he was the fall guy. A liberal economist who was a great admirer of Britain and America, Ryti was imprisoned by the Allies for 10 years in the trials which Russia demanded as a price of peace. His health never recovered. Other collaborators were much more fortunate. The mathematician and Nazi sympathizer Rolf Nevenlinna had to resign as rector of Helsinki University. But then, like the other Finnish intellectuals who backed the Nazis, he was left alone by the Russians. He took up a lucrative professorship in Switzerland, and in the 1950s became one of Finland's most revered public figures. His reputation remains virtually unblemished today. The reputation of Carl Gustav Mannerheim has, if anything, increased. Although just as guilty as Ryti in cooperating with the Nazis, his national popularity meant that it was too difficult for the Russians to put him on trial. He escaped any retribution whatsoever. After resigning as president, he took another even more rewarded retirement, which this time didn't involve shooting tigers. He was buried with full honors in 1951, and in 2004 was voted the greatest Finn. Finland itself came out of its association with Nazi Germany remarkably unscathed. It remains proud of the Finns who served in German uniforms. Although most Finns would still rather forget the darker moments of Nazi collaboration. Few countries can claim their relationship with Nazi Germany was a success. Finland, however, is the exception. even if it meant collaborating with some of the most vicious war criminals the world has ever seen.